So I don't want to awkwardly look at it, so it's going to get that part out of the way. So I'm Margaret Broadway. I'm the Deputy Director of the Planning, Development, and Research Department at Metro, which is the regional government for the Portland region. A little bit about me. I started my career actually as a corporate attorney. I'm a recovering attorney. So fun. So glad I left that career to work in public policy. I spent 6 years working at Oregon Department of Transportation, ODOT, in the director's office, doing high-level policy, sustainability, multimodal transportation. Then I spent 4.5 years at PBOT, where I was the active transportation and safety division manager. I think Kristin and I overlapped by maybe 2 weeks. I was on her interview panel, and then we hired her. And then I left, and I went to Metro to be the deputy director there. And so I really enjoy working at different levels of government and across governments, which is a good thing, because that's what Metro has to do. A little bit, I don't know, how many people have heard of Metro even? It's okay. Okay, all right, not bad, okay. Awareness, because sometimes my neighbors don't know, I'll tell you that. They're like, well, what do you do? So Metro is quite large. You know, we run venues, we run the zoo, we run arts, solid waste. The pieces that we do, planning and development, are, what am I clicking on here? Okay. Oops, I'm going to jump to this here. What we do in our department, we do land use, transportation, housing, economic development, economy, and data and modeling. We are also, our department is known as MPO, which is a transportation term of art, Metropolitan Planning Organization. Most places MPOs are just do transportation planning and finance, but Metro, we have a long history. I'm going to jump to our history that starts with land use. Now, 1974 is a really important year. First, it was when the history of land use started in Oregon. Governor McCall passed SB 100 land use. It also, I don't have it up here, but it was when we collectively, this region, fought the Mount Hood Freeway. If people heard that story, it's our legend that our waterfront would be a freeway right now if it wasn't a protest to the federal government at the time, which Kristin said was all about freeways. It also happens to be my birthday, so that's another, one year I was born, which makes it super special in my mind. Shortly after, they created Metro. It was a vote of regional government. They built on an existing MPO, and then we created an urban growth boundary. And we includes 24 cities and 3 counties. And a little bit about what we do at Metro. I work with 24 cities, 3 counties, ODOT, Port, and 3 transit agencies, major transit agencies every day. This is what we do every day. Intergovernment relations and communications and setting regional priorities. And voters directed Metro to create a future for land use, transportation, water quality, and natural areas, thus the 2040 growth concept, which is incredibly important. Kristin mentioned it. One quote I like to repeat is that the best transportation plan is a land use plan. Why? Well, think about the plazas that Kristin just talked about. People have to be able to walk there, right? I got into an argument with one of my colleagues from Texas at one of a national conference and said, we're going to build a greenhouse gas model, but we're not going to take land use into account. I said, well, how the heck are you going to get your VMT down? How are you going to start people driving? Because the only way to get people walking and biking is to make trips shorter and make things closer together. So this is incredibly important. And we concentrate growth in centers and along corridors. And here's just a couple examples. Here's Ornco Station, Hillsborough. This was a huge TOD, or transit oriented development investment, along with the light rail investments. And then I was just comparing it to other suburban places. But you see these concentrated centers everywhere. And I love these pictures because you can see this is Forest Grove and Cornelius are within the urban growth boundary. This is mind blowing. Look at that urban growth and how efficient that is. Wait for the next slide. Tell me where the urban growth boundary line is, right? Protecting green spaces, farms, and forests. This is the inside of the UGB. and the urban growth boundary is more about transportation. It's about protecting those green spaces and protecting the farmers. Just last week, we had farmers come and testify at Metro saying, please don't expand your urban growth boundary because it's so important for the food that we produce for people who live within the boundary. So the regional transportation plan is really a key tool for implementing it. So I'm going to go a little over the regional transportation plan and the climate smart strategy. But first I want to show you how this is called lovingly the octopus at my work. There's lots of octopus, but it's an important graphic because it shows the interplay and really the interconnectedness across the region of how people travel. So if you look at some of these numbers, they're pretty mind-blowing. You know, about 50% or 49% leave Clark County every day to go to work. Washington County, 46 people leave Washington County to go to work every day. Clackamas County, 65% of Clackamas County leave every day, right? And this is where they go. Right, so you see these big lines coming in and out. Look at like Washington County and Multnomah County basically swap on a daily basis. Is that wild? So it just shows the importance of having a regional government and having a table to solve regional solutions and having regional solutions. Yeah. And Marion's outside of our urban growth boundary, so I didn't highlight that one, but I just, you know, our planner insisted we throw it in because it is so fascinating to your point. And I was like, okay. I know. So, well,
is that in large part the state government is located there, or is it just because that is the closest outside of the metro area?
I would say it's the biggest employment center. The huge employment centers in Washington County and Multnomah County that are just not offered there. So we develop every 5 years a regional transportation plan. It is kind of similar, what Kristin was saying, as the TSP. She heard her talk about the transportation system plan for City of Portland. The RTP is the regional version of a TSP. It is a culmination of policies, programs, and projects that are collectively taken from all those cities and counties I mentioned. So we take the TSPs and then we prioritize those. It's a very complex and, as you can imagine, somewhat political process. So we have, our MPO is overseen by two bodies, a Joint Policy Advisory Committee that's made up of mayors and county commissioners and representatives from around the region. And then we have our Metro Council. And I put MPO because they together make the metropolitan MPO decisions, organization decisions. And I love these photos because right here, Councilor Gonzalez, who's a Metro Councilor, he is from Beaverton, also former executive director of Central Cultural, is having a heated debate with Ryan Winsheimer from ODOT Region 1 on TV Highway. I remember that. And then here you have Councilor Heisey, who was City of Milwaukee. She's running for mayor right now, feeling very strongly, and that's the mayor of Gresham, Mayor Stovall. That's the mayor of Vancouver, Washington County, and that's Councilor from Washington County. I'm sorry, Clark County across the river, and that's Councilor Gonzalez. So here you have City of Milwaukee sitting next to Gresham, sitting next to Washington County, having these debates. This is what we do at Metro. We facilitate these conversations. And in this case, we ask them to identify the goals for our region going for the next RTP. The goals will fall into objectives, and those will be performance measures and used as screening for the projects, as Kristin alluded to, although it's never as clean as I just articulated it. This is just kind of a snapshot of what the RTP does. I don't expect you to understand all of this, but I just wanted I like these symbols to show that it has layers within it. There is such thing as a regional bike network, a regional freight network, pedestrian network, vehicle transit, and then we have kind of regional design standards. It gives you a flavor of what we do. And then so now we are developing the next goal. So I said all those people recently met in August, and they were very clear. Our last RTP had 11 goals. They said, we want less than that. We want 5. And so this was developed and actually just approved by my council this morning at 10 a.m. I was there presenting on this. They want to focus our goals on the safe system, equitable transportation, climate action resilience, mobility options, and vibrant and prosperous communities. So those are the goals for the region that group of leaders decided on. And now what we're taking those as draft and getting a lot of public input. So I just want to make sure that I can say they're draft. We got approval to go forward and take them to the public for more feedback. At Metro, we also have a climate smart strategy. We were the first regional government in Oregon, and frankly, one of the first regional governments in the state to have one in 2014. I don't like this first bullet here. I probably wrote that because it says state law that applies to Metro. Well, the legislature did tell us to do climate smart, but we also raised our hand. There was a failed cap and trade bill. I was working at Salem at the time, around 2011, 2012. The cap and trade bill failed. Sorry, I go to bed at 8 o'clock too. Kristen knows this. So if I am hit that time, I am hit that time. So I'm trying to keep my energy up. And they said, well, regional government should come up with a plan to figure out how to reduce GHG from transportation. And all the other regional governments were like, no, we don't want to do it. And I literally remember Randy Tucker, the prior lobbyist for Metro, like getting him going, Metro will do it. Tell us to do it. So we did, and we are expected through that law to meet our state goals. I think the story is very similar to Kristin. In some ways, we've had good success at the region, but we've also struggled. Areas where we've succeeded adopting land use plans. We've succeeded in many ways in terms of investing in more biking and walking before climate smart. Some of our local cities, some of our suburban cities hadn't made that much of investment. We continue to work with our partners on like what's called TDM or transportation information. We were making a lot of progress on transit before COVID hit collectively, and we work very closely with TriMet. But that's one we're reevaluating now. And we have ways to go on things like parking policies, which do affect climate. I don't have time to go into that right now, but so as Kristin alluded to, we've had some success with the 2040 growth concept. This is a little bit of a weird map. It's a bubble map, but basically what it shows is where the new homes have been added in our centers, and you can see where the growth has happened, where we want it to happen. Most of it in the centers, and you can kind of see, you know, these little lines show like Wilsonville, which is the center, and Happy Valley, which is the center, and that's planned, and they're connected by these corridors. So we are realizing our dream of the 2040 growth plan. However, we've had challenges, and there's been some unintended consequences. Probably the most urgent and the most serious is a lack of affordable housing in our region. And I'm not saying that that is just caused by land use, but it is one that needs to be addressed by a land use and a housing strategy, as well as a transportation strategy. The need is way bigger than the availability of funds. And we have transportation challenges because people are getting, low income people and transit dependent people are being forced to move to the edges of our region. So it's a regional problem. We also need to address the racist past of urban planning. If you're not familiar with redlining, look it up. Racism was intentional, not by accident in our region. There were lines drawn on the map of where people could live or where they couldn't live. And unfortunately, there are lines drawn on the map of where I-5 went in. And I hope you know the story of the albino community being displaced, but this was an all Black community, and they were plowed through and removed, put in I-5. All Black community had lived there for many decades. Same with the entire area near Williams, that whole Vanport William, the hospital displaced people of color. That was a racist urban planning. We drew up those plans knowing that those people of color, and I say we collectively, and so that's something that we as on our organization talk about a lot as urban planners of how do we erase, you can't erase it, but how do you do intentional planning that tries to reverse some of the wrongs of the past and frankly just acknowledge it. So the good news is Metro has done a ton of work to try to make progress in the housing bond. The voters, thank you, because you guys are all voters, passed affordable housing bond in 2018. On the heels, passed a supportive housing services, which is really services for homeless people in 2020. This was huge for Metro, and frankly, we grew very fast and very quickly. And we are, I don't have a slide deck on this because it's a transportation class, but if you look it up, we're making incredible progress on our affordable housing bond. We are ahead of the schedule, and we have built over 50% of what we told the voters we would deliver on time and even on budget, even before time. So that is helping to start the need on housing. But we still have a problem around lack of funding for transportation. There was another measure in there in 2020, transportation measure. Metro tried to pass it and it failed. That's probably a whole nother discussion of how and why it failed, but it also happened when we put it on the ballot in COVID, where nobody was going anywhere. In fact, we were literally just about to roll out our campaign. We had just approved our campaign. We had this big campaign and advertisements. We're going to wrap buses, and it said, "Get home faster to have dinner with your kids. Have a more efficient system so you can spend time at home relaxing." Like, our whole thing was about making a quicker commute hour. And of course, we had to pull the whole campaign because COVID hit and the measure passed, did not pass. But we still lack funding sources in Oregon. This is one of my favorite slides, and it needs to be updated with the latest numbers. But Oregon only has a state gas tax and title registration fee. We do not have sales. So this is California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. Look at how much more money they have. So when you go to Seattle and they're like, "Oh, they're building out new light rail lines," they actually passed a new measure and they're above us up here now in the state. So we have a scarcity mindset, unfortunately, when it comes to funding in Oregon. And if it feels like there's not enough money for that CIP list that you're talking about, there's not. So it's a problem we need to solve, and we continue to work on it. I'm actually going to stop there because I'm going to go into a really wonky topic around tolling and congestion pricing. This is my lead-in slide. Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to take a note from Chris and take a little break. And feel free to stand up or stretch too, if you need to. Does anybody have any questions about who Metro is or what we do? Okay,
I
yeah.
have a question about land use. How does Metro influence land use if the city is kind of autonomous and able to create its own zoning, create its own storefront guidelines, architectural? How does Metro input land use? Does Metro have a unincorporated parts of Washington and parts of?
No, we are organization of carrots and sticks, but we have quite a few sticks in the land use. You have to be compliant with our regional land use functional plan. And we don't get into storefronts though. We really stay focused on zoning. We look for that balance of urban and rural, and it's called the reserves, like rural reserves, urban reserves. And so anytime there is a change to the comprehensive plan, it has to go through Metro. And then we work with the state agency of land use called DLCD division. DLCD. I'm not going to go through it, but we kind of have this regulatory authority. However, we also have what I call carrots, which is grants. And we give a lot of planning grants to communities. They're called 2040 grants. And so it's not that we're always saying, you need to do this with your land use. We give grants to say, hey, this is an area where you could potentially make denser, or you're looking at a main street, or you're looking at a plaza. Here's a grant to go envision that. And then we come in later and talk about what that zoning needs to be, or that balance of housing and it's usually housing, industrial, and green space are like the three big categories. And then we update our urban growth boundary every 5 years, and we're headed into a UGB update. It's called the UGB. Other questions? Yes. Okay, I'm gonna go with her, and then I know you have. Yeah.
So this graph is the Oregon, right? That's where Metro gets a lot of its funding from, is the state gas and distribution.
No, good question. So Metro, we work a lot with funding and federal funding, and that's probably like when you ask the TriMet finance question, I was like, oh, well, I spend way too much time with TriMet on finances because Metro, the MPO, all the federal funding kind of flows through us to our partners. And we run a grant program. Like, so for all those cities that I mentioned or talked about counties, they compete for discretionary funds. And then we also program funds, even funds that ODOT manages, into major projects. So if you guys heard of I-5 Bridge, right? All the federal funding for that has to come through our organization in those big tables of like JPAC for approval because of its tied to federal funding. Also, if a project wants federal funding, like any type of grant, whether it's transit or highway, it has to be in our RTP, it has to be on our project list, which is an incentive for locals to make sure they put their best foot forward when they're submitting their project list into the RTP. So thank you.
A lot of the community organizing around I-5 expansion seems to be directed to ODOT, but so how do you politically navigate those waters if you're really the kind of bridge into implementing funding?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Do you mind if I answer her question? Because I know you two had your hands up. Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
sorry.
No, that's okay. You're good. No, I-5 Bridge is, I mean, it is a fascinating and really important project in the fact that you have, you know, 2 DOTs, 2 MPOs, actually two counties, 2 cities, 2 transit agencies. We are all project partners. We all collaborate together at the technical table, the policy table, and the political tables and the oversight tables. And so we are at the table informing and shaping the project. It's super complex, which is why it hasn't gone off in 10 years. But I hope before anything comes to my, well, and definitely things come to my agency, it's often called our TIP amendments is the term, or a TIP, which is the federal funding, that I know, or my staff knows so much about the project that we're able to brief and be a part of it. Now, there's some times where we don't always agree with our DOT partners, and it can get pretty spicy at the JPAC table. You know, Rose Quarters was probably the most huge one, or the 205 tolling amendment. There was one amendment that got reversed and shot down by JPAC, and we had to do it all over again several times. So that does happen too, where the locals say, nope, this is not what I want for my community. So, go ahead.
I was curious about, when you first slide, you mentioned a lot of data modeling.
Yeah.
About how data, what you have at the MPO level versus the cities or the municipalities. How much of that is kind of shared? So everyone's looking at similar and consistent information.
Thank you so much for asking. It's such an important question. If you are interested in data layers, and we actually made our whole, we have geospatial data, has 150 layers. It's called RLIS, write it down, RLIS, all caps, Metro. We recently, I'm really proud of this because I recently started managing this team over a year ago. We made it open to everyone, public. Before, you had to have a subscription and you had to be a certain jurisdictional partner. So we're really in the open data movement. But if you have any problems, there's a contact info, because some of the data layers I've heard don't always work for like the average person with the average computer. But we have tons of geospatial data. Our partners heavily rely on us. So that RLIS geospatial data, every single city uses it, and they actually will pay in for the system to support it. It has everything from tax lot data, which is coded, so you can't tell like who lives where, to, you know, we have layers on environmental layers, like where wetlands are. We have housing layers. We have all sorts of transportation layers for the whole region. And then that's one, we call it the Data Research Center. And then the other arm we have is forecasting and modeling. And Metro has one of the most robust forecasting and modeling teams in the entire US. We have very strong modeling and forecasting. All of our partners rely on us to model for them. They come to us, and oftentimes, sometimes we even do modeling for ODOT. So our team did all the modeling for I-5 Bridge and has done all the modeling on the tolling issue, because ODOT did not have as much capacity as we did. So it's something that we're incredibly proud of, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk about it. But it's a lot more information on our website. Any other questions? Yeah.
So from my point of view, as a student that comes from Hillsborough Regional Planning, super
Yes,
important.
Hillsborough. Yes, Mayor Callaway. All
Love it.
right, love Mayor Callaway. Yes.
It's my commute to class is either 20 minutes by car in traffic,
Yeah.
or over an hour and a half by public transit. So through collaboration through different jurisdictions, is there expansion projects for Highway 26?
Thank you for asking that question. So, you know, we have gone around and around on that north-south connection. It needs to be improved. There's been all sorts of concepts, like there's this concept of like the western bypass, which would create a whole new highway. You've probably heard about it, like out and around and through Forest Park. It's never going to be built in that region, by the way, because people are trying to figure out the solution for that. So we have a joint study underway. You should really look into this. It's called the West Side Multimodal Study. It's a joint study by Metro with ODOT together to look exactly at what we're looking at. We're looking at all the options starting from 26 all the way down, kind of from Hall Boulevard on one side to the other. One of the problems is the tunnel, honestly. And it is, we're asking the question, what if you did everything you can but the tunnel, and what would the, expanding that tunnel cost? It's incredibly expensive to do that. We looked at it as part of the measure. But yeah, we are looking at, there's a big acknowledgement at Metro that that's a key mobility corridor that absolutely needs to be improved, but the levers to pull are not always obvious. We could drop. One of the things we're looking at is just dropping how many times the red line stops, right, in Washington County. We're looking at trying to make transit faster too, and or bus on shoulder concepts for buses, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it runs along the side. We have a pilot, one of those pilots out kind of near Wilsonville right now with Smart. So great question. Yeah.
I have a quick follow-up to that. Like, is there any impetus at TriMet to run any kind of like express train service like you might see in like Chicago, like has a whole line that goes from Evanston to downtown? I mean, is there any like stuff floating around to like run express trains from Hillsborough and like?
Yeah, so I think that that's kind of where you'll hear probably from TriMet. You heard Kristin talk a little bit that this idea of, you've heard of bus rapid transit. It's kind of a hybrid. It's between like a high capacity transit and transit buses. I really do believe that's going to be the future in our region. The Division project that just launched is one of many that's coming. We're also looking at bus rapid transit on TV Highway or Tualatin Valley Highway and 82nd Avenue. We also at some point will be studying McLaughlin out in Clackamas County. That's kind of the third corridor in line, but right now we're pretty intensely looking at TV Highway and 82nd Avenue. So yeah.
I work with Arterials.
Yeah.
Also too, because most of our rail lines are single track or
Yeah.
in certain ways, and it's extremely hard to basically looking at acquiring the right of ways for that and the third track.
Yeah.
And keep the frequency for the
Yes. A little, so I'm just doing a time check and I'm conscious of your ability. I'm good.
You're so good on time.
Okay, so I wish I had all these cute pictures of like painted plazas, but I'm just gonna talk about financing and tolling. I know. I mean, yeah, even that's like a picture of cars. Like, okay. So when this in 2017, a conversation heated up in our region and in the legislature about tolling. Should we be using tolling to pay for major, and the case saying we should use it for major projects was the question before the legislature, I would say. And there was a debate that happened in the legislature and a debate that continues today, whether tolling should be used to manage demand, like manage the entire system, or just as a revenue raising mechanism. So in 2017, the legislature directed ODOT to look at two specific tolling locations, I-205 and Rose Quarter. And it was a little awkward because the locations were based on potential future capital projects and not about how does that work with the system. So we have conversations with our colleagues from around the region and with ODOT, and Metro said, you know what, we really need to back way up and think about what are all the pricing mechanisms that we could use to raise revenue, right? The transportation measure failed, but what if we did straight tolling? How would that compare to congestion pricing, which is like variable rate tolling, more of what they have in Seattle, versus what if we increased parking. Or compare that to what's called the VMT tax or vehicle miles travel tax. In Oregon, this is also referred to as the Orgo program. It's got a couple different names, or user fee tax. That last bullet has a lot of different names. And then we said, and we're going to look at these 4 areas, and then we're going to assess them against our values. Which 4 of these does best for equity, climate, mobility, and safety? So that we're being really thoughtful and intentional about the pricing mechanisms. And so we also, in the background, I just want to acknowledge there's a lot going on. We had ODOT developing the I-205 tolling project. There's the interstate bridge project being, planned, which also has tolling on it. ODOT started looking at their own regional mobility pricing project, and City of Portland had their own task force on pricing options for equitable mobility. But we were able to sign a 3-way agreement between City of Portland and ODOT, and we committed in that agreement to all work together and share our data, so we are informing each other's work and process. So we ran models. Thank you for asking the modeling question. And we found from our model, so what we would do is we looked at different scenarios. So say for the VMT tax, we would assume that everybody was taxed a certain rate for like $1 per mile, for example. You compare that to like a $3 per mile. We also looked at tolling certain locations. We ran a modeling scenario. We just tolled the bridges downtown. And we compared them to each other. So there are total 8 scenarios. Said all 4 types addressed climate change and congestion. So they all encourage people to drive less. They all, there was 4 pricing types in all 8 scenarios, but the geographic distributions of the benefits and costs varied by scenario. So this is super important. What my big aha moment, and I'll use what we call cordon pricing the bridges. My big aha moment was seeing the modeling results from that. You know what happens when you toll all the bridges in downtown Portland? Everybody drove to East Portland, and the traffic looked horrible. It was like 82nd was a mess. Everything in North Southeast Portland was locked up and jammed. And you look at that and say, that's not the future we want, right? That's not. So these modeling runs were really important, because what we found was that the context really, really mattered. Oh, I'm sorry, this was bad formatting. The picture blocked the findings, but I'll just tell you the findings. So you can address climate change through tolling and pricing mechanisms, but you have to be super careful about who benefits and who burdens, and then where you send that traffic, because the other takeaway that from the modeling that I remember is there will be diversion. It is a human thing. It just happens when you look at the modeling results for tolling I-5, people just go to 205. You know what happened in our model when you also model the 205 at Glen Jackson? So you've got I-5 bridge and 205. People chose not to take the trip as much. The discretionary trip to Target started to fall off. They call it, our modelers call those lost trips. You start to see those discretionary trips go down because they're not like, yeah, I'll just drive around. So that was another aha. But really, we walked away being very concerned about who can pay and who cannot, and burden those low income people. So our findings and recommendations said that you can build affordability into a program. You can give discounts. You can exempt certain people. You need to do that work ahead of time and find out who the users are and how they're impacted. And then recommended that the revenue be used to address those problems. So if you're working in an area or you're tolling in an area that has a transit dependent population, put that money back into transit. So these are findings from our study. So I'm just going to leave that here real quick and take a little break. There's a lot more here that I didn't include in my slide. I will say from these findings, we went and took our findings to the Oregon legislature. And the project, when I say we, Elizabeth, Rose O'Hara, and I were asked to testify 2 different times in the Transportation Committee because they were trying to update their tolling law. And they did change the state statute, not as much as we wanted. But we're successful in writing into law that there must be a low income study and a low income program. So that was really exciting for us. We also added in language that they should look at the system fully and do so to manage demand. And then also use goals around climate. We also got certain language in there that said that tolling revenue can be used for nearby, adjacent, and parallel roadways. I remember those words because I wrote them, because we were very concerned about people getting diverted. So before, this was the study. The tolling debate continues. We changed state law, but the debate over tolling is far from over. ODOT is on track to deliver the 205 tolling project. They're marching forward in 2025. If you've been to Clackamas County anytime lately, you'll see no tolling signs everywhere. Yeah, you've probably seen them. They're at the Arch Bridge celebration on Saturday. I gotta watch time. So we're not done yet. And I think that purpose of whether you're tolling to raise revenue for a highway project or whether you're tolling to try to meet these other goals and manage demand is still not done. And an amendment to the RTP to add the 205 project in with tolling. Normal amendments take about 3 months. It took 9 months to even get through our JPAC table, and it had a list of conditions attached when it did. And there's huge discomfort. So I think, but that's okay, because it's important that we get this right. Once those tolls go up, or once we use one pricing mechanism, it's likely undone. I believe it is the thing that is going to change transportation as we know it more than anything we've done in the past couple centuries. So I'm going to stop there. I was going to talk about one more wonky thing. How's my time?
You're good on time.
You're good on time. Does anybody have like tolling, pricing conversations? Want to know my favorite though? My favorite is the VMT tax. And I'll tell you why, because the benefits and burdens right there. And look up, if you're interested in this topic, look up Orgo. It's a pilot program that ODOT launched. But that's really where you saw the fairness start to creep in a little bit more. It, especially if you had some kind of low income program, because you simply pay by how much you drive. And especially if that revenue is put back into transit, biking and walking, that had the best kind of benefits and burdens analysis. And so if I could wave a wand and do it all again, I'd probably change the 217 state legislative law and go towards a VMT tax, especially now that EVs are coming and the gas tax is declining. So any questions about this? Okay. All right. Last topic, hang in there with me. Does anybody know what, does anybody here heard of level of service or V over C? A few of you, okay. So this is the least known and least understood policy, but probably one of the most important policies in transportation, right, Kristin? She's over here nodding, 100%. I'm probably not going to be able to communicate its importance to you through these slides, because this policy is how we define mobility. So just think about it. How would you define mobility? Like everybody just put it in their heads. You don't have to shout out, but just like, how would you define that? Well, how it's been defined for the past, I don't know, at least 50 years since the interstate system's been around, since Eisenhower era has been created and the AASHTO book has been created, has been defined over something called level of service, or V over C, which is vehicle capacity, which is how many cars can you get through in a certain space, the capacity. So what's your throughput to vehicles to capacity? So I'm explaining to this before I get my slide deck, because I think it's foundational. The measure is, you look at a roadway, you say, what's the capacity of the roadway? So capacity would be like 2 lanes, right? And then you would measure how many vehicles you can get through it in a certain period of time. And then you would give the level of service, like an A, if cars were flying through at a certain speed, like a B, if they were kind of coming through at 40 miles an hour, a C, if they were slower or stopped over certain periods of time. That has led to the expansions of highways and intersections over and over and over again, right? Because you remember Kristin's graphic about, if you're not using transit and you're using single occupancy vehicles, you're just going to fill that space, right? It just fills up. It's like you're chasing something that can't be achieved. So the mobility policy in Oregon, and this is true across the country, is used all over the place. It was used in plans. It's currently used in like development code. So that would be like a developer coming in and asking, what do I need to do? What transportation improvements do I need to make? And the levels of service would say, well, you've got to allow for a lot of cars, big parking lots, big driveways, right? And also managing and designing roads, which I talked about. There's also zoning and land use implications. And I want to say that these standards are set by ODOT. Although let's say, I think this is my next slide. In 2000, there was a negotiation between Metro and ODOT to have a special mobility policy for the region. It was still level of service, and it still kind of had, you see here, these targets, 1 hour target, 2 hour. I'm not going to try to apply them, but it was still bad policy. It was slightly better than the rest of the state, which basically allowed a little bit more congestion, but it still was targeted to have that still the same framework of getting more vehicles through capacity. And so finally, in 2018, we said, this isn't working. So what started to happen is everywhere around the region, from Hillsborough to Gresham to City of Portland, everything was failing over the VOC. And if you believe everything was an F, the mobility policy would tell you the only way to get to it was to widening it. Well, we can't do that with Rose Quarter. So even the ODOT engineers are saying, this isn't working because I'm never going to get Rose Quarter to 6 or 7 lanes, but my VOC standard is telling me that's what I should do. So we actually, Metro and ODOT came together and said, we need to come up with a new standard for our region. We signed an agreement. It took us almost 6 months to make the agreement to work together on this. So that's how contentious this topic is. But we got there, and we're almost there. We've got a draft final that's going to approval after 2 or 3 years. And again, what are we doing with redefining mobility? Desire to shift focus from vehicles to people, goods, and services. Realizing we couldn't afford to expand our policy, but also that we want to meet our goals that I mentioned before around equity, safety, and climate. So this was the project timeline, and you can see I'm like, we're almost at the end. Here we are. It's been, in fact, we're blowing past this, but we've done a lot of project scoping and background. And I'll tell you a little bit about the beginning where we started. So first we said, what defines mobility? We asked that question to stakeholders. We did focus groups. We did engagement with CBOs. And they told us, I define mobility through access, through efficient system, through reliability, through safety, through transportation options. Did any of these words kind of come into your head when I asked you how you define mobility? Okay, so get some head nods, right? And so, the vision for urban mobility in the Portland area, people and business can safely, affordably, efficiently reach goods, services, and places and opportunities they need to thrive by a variety of seamless and well-connected travel options that are welcoming, convenient, comfortable, and reliable. So that statement was our North Star. So we had a long ways to go to get to an actual measure, right? But we used that as our North Star. Then we identified the policy elements, and we looked at over 100 different measures. Kittleson was our consultant. They were amazing. We looked at all the different ways. And then we tested case studies, and we said, what are different ways? Could you measure it based on vehicle miles? But could you also measure it, say, on system completeness? Could you measure it on how many people are biking and walking a day? What are the different ways to do this? So we did case studies and findings, and we came to these 3 measures as kind of our final set of measures. So one we're calling efficiency, which is a VMT per capita, is vehicle miles. And that's how many people are driving. Are we using our system really efficiently? And this gets to, are we reducing our GHG? Because we want, this is the kind of the opposite thinking of the VOC. We want people to drive less, right? We want a standard of less single occupancy vehicles. Think of that triangle that Kristin put up there. This is kind of similar to getting at saying an efficient system is one where less people are driving and taking the single occupancy vehicle. That one can be done at kind of the planning level at the big picture. But we said that doesn't work for the system level. So then we looked at another measure and called system completeness. Are there travel options? Are there biking, walking, transit, truck options, and vehicle options? And do they take them where they need to go? So this is something that can be done much more at the micro level, at the community level, at the neighborhood level. And then lastly, we have a reliability measure. And this is especially for what we call the throughways or the interstate system on speed. And this was one that we have spent the last 6 months or year talking over with ODOT. They really wanted something that wasn't system completeness for the highway system, because they're not going to have biking and walking on the highway system. But we also didn't want V over C. So we said, what would best communicate what people feel? And it's really the reliability. It's the stop and go. How many times is there an emergency where you stop? And is there consistent kind of speed flow? Not a, like for Metro anyway, not at 60 miles an hour, but that nice 30 or 40 where you can rely on getting through. So we're using that only, we're using the reliability measure only on the interstate system, or what Metro calls the throughways. The system completeness measure will be used on all the other types of roadways like arterials and neighborhood collectors. So this is kind of how we measure. So we didn't come up with one perfect measure to answer your question. We came up with 3. One to be used at the highest level, one to be used at the local level, and then one to be used on the interstate. And so the current policy focused on vehicle travel. This new policy will focus on people and goods. You know, the past policy was vehicle flow and capacity. The new objective is a reliability, safe and complete system. The current policy is very focused on rush hour. I didn't really get into that, but oftentimes you look at level of service in the rush hour. And the updated policy looks at travel throughout the day. Again, this gets away from just focusing on vehicles and having a multimodal standard and systematic evaluation of impacts. The current policy relies on existing data and tools, and the updated policy is likely to direct to new data and tools. And I can't tell you how many times we heard from transportation professionals that are incredibly smart, dedicated transportation planners in our region to say, well, we don't know exactly how to measure that other stuff. And it's like, guys, we are smarter, we are better. We can figure this out. The V over C is just what everybody knows. That's what engineers feel comfortable stamping. That's what planners feel comfortable planning. So doing this, we have to create new data, new tools, new systems, and really kind of change the transportation profession in our region to make this happen. But I believe we can do hard things, something I say at work all the time. So we're really excited because we are in the final shoot with this draft policy. We are taking it to Metro Council for JPAC for final approval, and I believe it'll be the new mobility policy. Oh, I've got this extra slide that shows like next steps. I'm not gonna, this is how long it's gonna take to actually implement it, to get all the data and tools, to amend it into the Oregon Highway Plan, but I'm not gonna bore you with all these steps. The exciting part is we're gonna adopt the final policy pretty soon.
This is huge.
This is huge,
This is
isn't it?
huge,
I know,
yeah.
this is huge.
This is huge.
Yeah, and we've been kind of quietly working on it for 2.5 years because we were in COVID. I will say that we were insistent that ODOT headquarters was at the table, as well as ODOT Region 1, because we needed it to be amended into the Oregon Highway Plan as well. Because the Oregon engineers aren't going to follow it if it's not in the Oregon Highway Plan. That's just the way the world works. We had to have it in the regional plan. And then we are putting money into place to develop all the guidance and the tools to use it. So it's really exciting, and it's kind of sad that it's taken us this long to get here, because it's a really old, outdated policy.
As
that
a
we're
former
finally
traffic engineer, this is like mind-boggling to me.
But yeah, that like Hillsborough or all these cities are going to be using these new standards. It's very exciting. So I will stop there. Any questions? Yeah, you have to be in traffic engineering to really understand what a big shift this is.
Yeah, no, this is huge, and it's been so quiet. I didn't even know.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think the feedback loop item now relative to crashes and ODOT on Bradway within the city of Portland and other jurisdictions, ODOT continues to design the way they design without
Right.
following their blueprint for
The bud
urban, yeah.
design, yeah.
How is the,
Yeah, so this is a topic near and dear to my heart. They're often called orphan highways or urban arterials. A little bit of history, and I almost talked about this because this topic is near and dear to my heart. Because we have studied this for so long and it's such a priority for our whole region. This is something that every city and every county has. They have an orphan highway or they have an ODOT owned formerly highway in their
82nd
community.
Avenue.
82nd Avenue is one of them. And what happened, so if you go back, if you really want to geek out, there's a history book on this. ODOT has incredibly history books, but what happened was during the Eisenhower era, when they were building huge interstate systems, they actually started in Southern Oregon. They kind of went up through California and they started to, this is happening in the 70s, right? 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They actually didn't complete I-5 till 1981 was the last big interstate to build, but starting 50s all the way to the 80s. And in their plans, they have lots of plans where they looked at the dirt roads or the what's called kind of like farm to table roads, and they paved over them. They said this is now going to be our interstate system. But when they got to the Portland region, it was already somewhat developed because there was a big port. And they put in their notes, we can't pave over these because there's already people on them. So we're going to pave as closely to them as we can get. We're going to aim to 4 to 8 blocks in some places. They wrote their notes, 4 to 8 blocks. Well, think about Barber and I-5, right? 4 to 8 blocks away. I-205, 82nd, right? TV highway, 26. And so they basically took what were state roads and they built the interstate system next to it. At that time, what should have happened is then you would have said, okay, now that we built the interstate system, we need to have a conversation about the purpose of this roadway over here. That's called functional class in transportation. What's the functional class of it? And we should have a conversation about ownership. That conversation never happened. So those roads were left and the people on them to figure it out for themselves. And it was a huge mess because ODOT's policies and the federal policies, FHWA, from back then till now say prioritize the interstate system. And so I like to say it's a history of disinvestment, where you take what constrained funds you had and you put them on the interstate and you let the terrible roadways get, their pavement ratings go from good, fair, bad to poor over and over again. We were just today touring and we we're out at Hall Boulevard. That's another one that you may be familiar with. Terrible shape, that pavement. ODOT owns it. ODOT owns it, right? And they also didn't, so ODOT, the state did not invest lighting, sidewalks, all those things Kristin was talking about. And so we have a huge problem in our region. And we've been doing a couple of different things. First, we did a big jurisdictional transfer study and highlighted 11 roadways for study and ways to cost estimation tool, when like a cost estimating tool and like what it takes, legal examples of how to transfer it. So you can look at a jurisdictional transfer study, Google Metro, you'll find it. I was actually pretty proud because it was used in the transfer of 82nd. I remember Rep. Pham asked me for a copy in the speaker's office. She's like, I heard you know something about this. Can I get a copy? I was like, yes, speaker. I was virtually running to her office being like, please use this, because these legislators were trying to figure out what a transfer was and how to transfer to 82nd. So it was used, which was a huge moment for all of us. But we'd like to see more of those transfers. We'd like to see the legislature fund those transfers. But beyond transfers, there is absolutely a need for urban design. And Metro was a big proponent of the ODOT urban design manual. We have our own urban design manual. And so when we're working on these streets, we always encourage, if it's still under state ownership, we push urban designs, because the interstate design, I mean, imagine some of these roadways I just mentioned, they are so different than an interstate, right? We have tons of 82nd Avenues. They're all over our region and they need to be taken care of. And we need leadership from the state government, federal government, and local governments to take care of them. And so in the RTP, in the 2023 RTP, we are doing an urban arterial strategy that outlines the different strategies that we're using, that includes some of the tools I mentioned, as well as some investment strategies that we're recommending. And we had a JPAC workshop on that topic like a month ago. I think that's online. That's kind of new, underdeveloped, more to come there. Yeah. that's probably a way longer answer than one, but I get fired up about these issues.
Focus on tolling, is it because we don't think we'll ever have the political will to have sales?
Oh, good question. That would require me to get into the psyche of the state legislature, which I don't know if I could do. I think it goes back to that scarcity mindset. We just don't have a lot of tools in our toolbox. And we really need revenue for transportation. And without a sales tax, it's a really tough nut to crack. So I would say yes and no, but I never like to try to explain Salem. Sorry. Yes.
1%.
I'm sorry, this gentleman had his hand up. Yeah.
It's interesting that listening to this conversation about we want to make active transportation modes available and get incentives for people to start utilizing them. How much of the cultural aspect of how we are as Americans and our attachment to cars does Metro try to contend with and understand?
Yes, great question. We do track that and we do invest in that. We have a regional transportation options program. And sometimes you'll hear it called transportation management, where it's basically outreach and education about different modes available. Metro funds PBOT's robust program that I used to manage, incredibly proud of. And like for a good example was that the program PBOT does is they offer like for certain locations and certain strategies like low income houses, a transportation wallet. Actually, my suggested name was the passport. I got rejected. I don't know if you know that history. Didn't know that, but you know, I also, well, there's other reasons why that might have not been a good name, but they give like a wallet of like, you're moving into a new housing unit, you're moving to a new place. Here's a transit ticket, try it. Here's a bike share ticket, try it. Metro funds a lot of like maps and outreach. So somebody moves to a new area. Oh, here's the bike network. Like all those bike there maps, all funded by Metro. Right? We fund all of that stuff. And these are expensive programs. We also have been working very deeply with CBOs and communities of different languages and trying to get kind of word out about what's out there and what's available. Like, how do you get to the bus stop? When does it come? Because a lot of times foreign language can be a huge barrier. So we do invest in that, probably not enough. But it's weird because there's not a lot of political will to fund that. It's not as sexy as cutting, a big project with concrete. So every funding cycle, every 3 years we do our federal funding, and I have to be like elbows out like mama bear, like don't call it like our regional transportation options. Don't touch that. And we need that. We need to keep our eye on the culture, education, outreach, so people know how to access it. So great question. Yes.
I'm sort of trying to like connect some dots with like the vehicle or miles traveled.
Yeah, vehicle miles traveled.
And like sort of like, yeah, like.
Why is that important?
No, like because of the pandemic, also like people being able
Yes.
to work at home and like equity, like my mind, I don't know what the data is, but like a lot of lower paid jobs still require you to come in and like, yeah, I don't know, connecting those and
Yes.
have thoughts.
Yes, such a good question. So I wish I had the slides from our emerging trends study. So we did emerging trends. I feel like I have a study for that. But we looked at this issue. So we were going into the RTP, which I talked about, but we knew that the system had fundamentally changed, that people's lives had changed. And people are like, oh, well, traffic's not going to fill up because everybody's working from home, or maybe they're only going to work 2 days a week or whatever. So we pulled a bunch of data working with a team of consultants, and we found just that the people who are low income and work in the service industry not only have continued to drive, but drive more, drive farther. So that is a trend in it. And we have to be really careful because I think and I have to be careful as a white person, as a white planner, it's easy to say, everybody's doing what I'm doing, right? I'm walking to school with my family, like Kristin was saying, or I'm working at home 3 days a week, so everybody else, but it's true that it is not. And the other trends that we saw was, delivery services up. So part of the reason you're seeing more traffic on the roadway is because you create a trip every time you order Uber Eats, every time you order Amazon. If you click 3 in a row, you've probably created more VMT than you would if you've left your house. If you're like, I want this from Amazon, I'm gonna buy this, I don't know where you guys buy your stuff, but Joe's Warehouse or whatever, and I'm gonna order my dinner, boom, boom, boom. You just put 3 carts in the roadway. And a lot of those deliveries are day of. Then you're sending that car straight into traffic. So you could be in your car being like, oh, I can't believe I'm stuck in traffic while you're ordering your Uber Eats and you're competing with the guy who's delivering your dinner to try to free up to get home, right? So that was another dynamic we saw. But there's no doubt that, go back to your original question, that people of color and low income people were definitely more affected in the pandemic. And we have to rethink the way that we do some of our policies. And one of the reasons that like a VMT measure is very attractive is because there's a direct link to GHG, to climate. So it's, people look at vehicle miles traveled as a goal because it is the easiest and most simplest way to figure out whether your vehicles are putting greenhouse gases. But if we push on that goal too hard, or we push on that with low income people who have to drive to their jobs because that's what they can afford to do and that's what they can access, then we're not meeting our equity goals. So we have to be looking at both of those at the same time and not pushing too far back and far.
I think one thing I'd mention is that transit, particularly during the as transit demand has changed in the pandemic. Like transit on 82nd Avenue line 72 didn't change nearly as much as crosstown lines service in the city. Off-peak riders didn't change much as peak ridership. What used to be ridership, we should say. And so I think it's TriMet is really responding to that. They just put out a new service plan for public review, the forward together. And so when they come next week, it'd be interesting for you to ask them about that and how they're responding, because they're really thinking about how their service planning and can respond to changing workforce needs and centering equity in that work. So I think it's really important. My husband works in the university department, and during the pandemic, we had coworkers who bought cars for the first time because they could no longer reach their jobs by transit because transit service was so diminished. And you know what? They had gone back to transit, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big thing that we're going to need to overcome is in some ways people's patterns. VMT went down for a while, it's not down anymore. As you probably know, it's fair around. VMT is now different, it's not. So that the initial beginning and like, oh, maybe there's a climate benefit here. It's like medical, social health emergency. But that has not worn out in the long run for us. It just changed.
I put a link to the forward together.
It's really good.
Yes, I put a link to it in our.
Awesome.
Oh, cool.
Take the survey.
I was gonna suggest doing that too, you beat me to it.
Yes. Get a round of
You
applause
get
to
an A.
Margi.
Oh, okay.
We're at time for class too. We're right at 8:40. We didn't even go for a break, but this is such a rich conversation. So thank you. Next week I'm building a break.
Okay, it's fun to talk about this stuff.
What I do.
I think that Margi can sense that too.
Yeah.
Definitely passionate.
We're good. Go. Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
So nice to meet you. Always nice to meet you.
Really.
So sad.
I know that question.
Yeah.
About to talk to at TriMet for student outreach. So his title is different because he got reworked, but this is he now runs that program.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, he's like, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. I will connect that.
All right.
Thank you.
I have to